Very good evening. Our special guest tonight is Right Worshipful Brother Kevin Thompson, my Worshipful Master from Hope of Kurrachee Lodge, Grand Lodge of Scotland. I'm deeply honored, Kevin. You accepted to share your knowledge with us. Thank you again, Kevin. I'm deeply honored. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Claudia. It's a great pleasure to be with you tonight. And I'm here to talk about one of Scotland's most famous sons, who was, of course, our poet, Robert Burns, one of the most famous known Scots throughout the entire world. In fact, just as an aside, there are more statues of Robert Burns throughout the world than almost any other person in living memory. The only one that beats him, strangely enough, is Queen Victoria. But he was well loved throughout the world. And my contention is that had he not been a Freemason, we would probably never have heard of him. He would just have been a poet in a small parish of Mauchline, and that would have been the end of it. But luckily for us, both he and many of his contemporaries were, in fact, Freemasons, and that allowed him to come to the attention of the wider population. Much of his work has Masonic influences in it, and we're going to touch on quite a lot of those tonight. Many of his songs and poems were written about fellow Masons, and quite often there are Masonic references in them. These are not secret, so it's fine for me to share them with you. What I thought I might do tonight is actually start with a little song, and this song is one Robert Burns wrote for himself on his 28th birthday, and there's a kind of subtle Masonic reference in the second last verse. I won't do the whole thing because there's quite a lot of verses, but just to give you a taste, and I'm going to illustrate what we're doing tonight with a few songs and a bit of poetry too. So here we go. Here. There was a lad was born in Kyle, but whatna day and whatna style. I doubt it's hardly worth the while to be so nice with Robin. Robin was a roving boy, a rantin' roving, rantin' roving. Robin was a roving boy, rantin' roving, Robin. Our monarch's time was the year Badin, was 25 days began. 'Twas then a blast of January wind blew Hanselin on Robin. For Robin was a roving boy, a rantin' roving, rantin' roving. Robin was a roving boy, a rantin' roving, Robin. He'll hae misfortunes great and small, and I heard abune them all. He'll be a credit to us all, we'll all be proud of Robin. For Robin was a roving boy, a rantin' roving, rantin' roving. Robin was a roving boy, a rantin' roving, Robin. And then there's this wee subtle Masonic content that he sneaks in here that says, as sure as 3 times 3 mak 9, I see by ilka score and line, this chap will dearly like our kind, leaves me on the Robin. For Robin was a roving boy, a rantin' roving, a rantin' roving. Robin was a roving boy, a rantin' roving, Robin. So there's a wee taste. We'll not do the whole thing, but that gives you some idea. And he's laughing at himself in there. He wrote that for his 28th birthday, talking about how much of a difficult life he had, but hopefully he was going to be well thought of in the times to come. And as I said, there's that subtle Masonic reference in there. So let's crack on anyway and look about some of his Masonic career. A lot of this comes from various books that I've read. There's one of them. There's also Harvey's famous book, William Harvey, a very prolific author in Scotland, and much of his work has been republished in this sort of format. So there's that. There's some very old books. You see the price on this one's 2 shillings. It's been a long time since Britain used shillings as currency, so that gives away some idea how long this goes back. It doesn't actually have a date in it. But much has been written about Burns and the impact that masonry made to him and that he made on Freemasonry. If you go into any Scottish lodge today, you will find a picture of Robert Burns somewhere in it. Likewise, if you go into any library in Scotland that was built by Andrew Carnegie, who was a great fan of Robert Burns, you will always find a bust of Burns in the library, because when he gave the money to build these libraries, his one condition was that Scotland's famous poet should have a bust somewhere in the library. So anyway, there was one lodge in Tarboughton, which is the village Burns joined in, chartered in 1771, not from Grand Lodge of Scotland, because it predates it in some ways, but from Lodge Mother Kilwinning. In 1773, Masons, as they often do, went their separate ways. A group split off from that lodge and formed a second lodge called St David number 174. And the original then changed its number, only to be reunited back with the original lodge only 9 days after Robert did his first degree. So here's the distinction of being the only person who actually joined during that hiatus. And although St James was clearly the older lodge, it was St David's names that was used. So he was initiated as an apprentice in Lodge St David, which is now on the Scottish roll as number 133, in Tarboughton on the 4th of July, 1781. He was 22 years old, and you can see up there an extract from the minute book is there. Robert Burns in Lochlee was entered as an apprentice, which is quite interesting because the spelling of his name has changed, and that raises some questions about the authenticity of that, perhaps, because when Burns was born, his name was Burness, and it was only later in his life that he changed it to Burns. So we'll leave that just now anyway. We'll come back to that. Interesting to see the master's name was Henry Cowan, which always raises a smile with Masons when I talk to them about it. Cowan being a warning word in Masonic terms, as many of you will know. The first three brethren mentioned were not actually office bearers and must have been acting for the evening, so perhaps they were as short as office bearers there as we sometimes are today. His initiation fee was 12 shillings and sixpence. In today's terms, that's so little money, it's hardly worth trying to translate it, but you'd be talking 12.5 pence. Like many other times in his life, he came in amidst controversy because the lodges had split and would eventually get back together again. He's the only brother, as I say, that was initiated into that before the two lodges split again. And let's go on to slide. Lodge Sir David Tarboughton now has many artifacts of Burns, and it's interesting to go along if you get the chance and see what they've got there. You'll see the two lodges play very heavily on the Burns legacy, and there are things there like the gavel that he used and the chair he sat in and so on, and you can go into these. He also formed a club called the Tarboughton Bachelors Club, which met in this building in the village of Tarboughton. And the only criteria for joining were that you had a fondness for a member of the opposite sex. And Burns welcomed many of his male friends in on that basis. And that's where they started doing some genuine debating, which of course overflowed into the lodges. Just as an aside, that building still exists today. And once a year, we try and hold a Burns supper in those very premises in memory of what it was used for going back to that time. So many of Burns's targets, if you like, in his poems came from people that he met in the craft. And when he joined the lodge, the master at that time was a guy called St John Whiteford. But back in those days, the master very rarely attended the lodge. He was just a figurehead, a name on the letters, really, and it was frequently the deputy master that ran the lodge. And Burns quickly rose to deputy master and was, in fact, in effect, the practicing master of a lodge for 4 years, with John Whiteford, the baronet of Ballochmyle, the actual master, who rarely appeared. And Ballochmyle features heavily in Burns' life. He wrote that beautiful song about Ballochmyle, the bonny lass of Ballochmyle, about a girl he spied from afar, and who had no time for him, but he wrote her that beautiful poem, which became a song. The bonny lass, the bonny, bonny lass, she's the bonny lass of Ballochmyle. And although she had no time for him, the story goes that later on in life, she kept the copy that he gave to her in her bedside drawer, and it was found there when she passed away. So she was obviously very touched by it. The secretary of that lodge was John Wilson, the schoolmaster. And he is made famous in one of Burns' works, Death in Dr. Hornbook, because as an aside to the meagre earnings he makes as a schoolmaster, he practices medicine, and he does so very unsuccessfully, many of his clients dying. So there's that beautiful satirical piece, Death in Dr. Hornbook, which Burns wrote, where this drunk meets Death as a person on the way home, and Death's complaining that he can't do his business anymore because Dr. Hornbook is stealing all the people he would lead to death away from him. So he was taking a punt at one of his friends in that, as he so often did. The Cross Keys in Burns Street, Tarbolton, was where the lodge held its meetings, where Burns was master, and you can see some idea of that there in that slide. Let me just see if I can get these to pass on. And as I said earlier, to claim his fame, Burns's mother lodge is now onto their standard, which sits there, as you can see. There's the chair I talked about, which allegedly Burns sat in, and the plaque is to that effect. You can see on the front of the chair there. And again, Burns features heavily on the jewels from that lodge. Obviously, they're going to cash in on it, and that's just what they're trying to do. The apron, the deputy master's jewel, which Burns wore, the candlesticks, which used to light the altar on the two wardens and the master, all that is there and guarded very jealously, quite correctly, by the lodge itself. There's the gavel I mentioned to earlier. There's the chair he would have sat in as master of the lodge, and the Bible that he used. That is hugely important to historians, and the fact that it adds an aura of authenticity when you visit that lodge, if you're someone who's interested in Burns and how he affected the craft. There's also his mark, and I've seen a few people wearing ties with that on. So Burns became a mark mason, and that was the mark he chose. And as I say, you can see that around and about sometimes on people's ties. There's John Whiteford, the guy I talked about, who was actually the master of the lodge, done in kind of caricature form. But Burns stood in for him because he really attended the actual lodge itself. There is Ballochmyle, the beautiful place that he lived in. It's now all flatted, but at that point in Burns' lifetime, it was all owned by him, and it was to the bonny lass from there that he penned that song I talked about earlier. The Lass of Ballochmyle, which became one of these chapbooks, which was sold for kind of sixpence or something. You see the date on there is 1823 or something like that. So long after Burns had passed away, people were making money out of his work. It was Whiteford that advised Burns to buy the farm in Ellersland near Dumfries. He actually had to build the farm buildings. There was nothing on it at the time. And that river you can see in the background is the River Nith. And that, the story goes, he was walking alongside that when he got the inspiration for his poem that everybody knows the world over, Tam O'Shanter. Burns' story about the witches comes from there. So I've told you about the schoolmaster, and that's him meeting Death as he walks along, Death and Dr. Hornbook. So already he's starting to use friends from the craft in his works. The Twa Dugs, the steward in Lodge Tarbolton, was featured in one of Burns' favourite poems called The Twa Dugs. He was the whipper-in to General Montgomery, one of the lower servants. And that poem was so important to Burns when he published his first edition, which was the Kilmarnock edition. He had to consider very carefully what to open that book with to try and attract customers to buy it. And that was the poem that he used at the very start. So if you look today at a facsimile version of the Kilmarnock edition, the very first poem in it is the Twa Dugs. And Burns used great skill here because in his time, the gentry would rarely have spoken to the servant class, except to tell them what to do. But Burns had this idea if they were trying to compare their lives, and the rich man saying, well, how bad is your life, poor man? And the poor man saying, well, it's not as bad as you might think because da-da-da. So that they can have that conversation, he uses their dogs. So we have two dogs there, Caesar and Lewis. And Caesar is the rich man's dog and Lewis is the poor man's dog. And they have this beautiful conversation in an exciting poem which lasts about 7 minutes. It's very good to see. Interestingly enough, many artists tried to cash in on Burns' fame, and there's paintings and sketches and things like that, and they quite often got it wrong. And here's an example of that, because that was painted by Landseer, a very famous poet, and I don't know what his two dogs are, but they're not the dogs that they should be, because if you read the poem at all, one is a Newfoundlander, which is a big hairy kind of beast, and the other is a collie, a ploughman's collie. So he got it wrong on both counts with the dogs in his painting. That's just a by the by. So here's what they should like. They should look like, when I go out doing Burns suppers, that's my Newfoundie on the right, and that's Lewis, my ploughman's collie on the left. So this is where Burns was signing the book in his own hand, Robert Burness, DM, when he was Deputy Master, because that's the name he was born with. But in the 25th of May, 1786, he drops the ES and he becomes Robert Burns. And without him having been a member of the craft, and without us getting access to the minute books, we would not know when his name change actually happened. But we've got it right to the day there, simply because he used it when he signed a copy of the minute book, which is a fantastic piece of history. Everyone talks about Robert Burns, but up till that point, he was not Robert Burns. He was Robert Burness, which was the name of his father. One of his great friends, Gavin Hamilton, features in Holy Willie, one of his poems taking a punt at the controversies in the church, and particularly the elders who would go out and try and spy on people and catch them out sinning when the elders themselves were often the worst offenders. And that's what Holy Willie's prayer is all about. This friend, Gavin Hamilton, features in it. He was, as you can see, a Mauchline lawyer and a landlord and a good friend to Burns. And it was him that persuaded Burns, when he needed some funds, to gather his poems together and try and get them published. So, needless to say, Gavin Hamilton was, of course, a Freemason. The publisher that they approached in Kilmarnock was another Freemason. And many of his friends, who were also Freemasons, put up the funds to make that actually happen. Burns was planning to go to Jamaica. Without going too far into his private life, his lady friend Jean, who he tried to marry but was prevented from doing so by her husband, was pregnant, and the husband, by her father rather, and the father Armour was chasing Burns for alimony. And life was very hard, and he fell in love with another girl, which he quite often did. He bounced back very quickly and said he was going to go to Jamaica with her to run a slave plantation, which is fascinating when you look at Burns' later life and how anti-slaves he was. Like, one of his songs is The Slave's Lament, whereas the poor slaves landing in a foreign land and lamenting having left his wonderful life. And that's how we come to see Burns now. But at that time, he was seriously considering going away to work in one. And to raise money for that, Gavin Hamilton and several of his friends persuaded him to put the Kilmarnock edition together. And this is what it looks like. Came out in July 1786. The printer there, John Wilson, as I said, another Mason, which is quite important. And it was a huge success, much more so than Burns ever thought would happen, and went on to become further editions when he went to live in Edinburgh. So we'll backtrack slightly, because just before he's ready to leave for Jamaica, he can see the money starting to come in from these poems and he can afford to go. He writes a very sad farewell to his brethren in St. James Lodge, Tarboughton. And it's called Adieu, a heart-warm, fond adieu. And it really gets sung because it's a Masonic song. So unless you're in Masonic circles and into Burns, it doesn't have. But I'll give you a taste of it now, because the sentiment in it is pure Burns, and you can see how upset he is at having to leave the friends that he's made in the lodge and possibly Freemasonry itself, because he doesn't know if it's going to be there where he's going. It goes like this. Adieu, a heart-warm, fond adieu, dear brethren of the mystic tide, you favoured ye in light and few, companions of my social joy. Though I to foreign France must hie, pursuing fortune's slithery ball, with melting heart and brimful eye, I'll mind you still when I'm far away. Oft have I met your social band and spent the cheerful festive night, honoured by supreme command, presiding o'er the sons of light, and by that fire laughing bright, which none but craftsmen ever saw. Strong memory on my heart shall write these happy scenes when I'm far away. May freedom, harmony, and love unite you in the grand design beneath the omniscient eye above, that glorious architect divine, that you may keep the unerring line still rising by the plummet's law, till Lord of bright completely shine, shall be my prayer when I'm far away. And you farewell, whose merits claim justly the highest badge to wear. Heaven blessed your honoured noble name. To masonry and Scotia dear, a last request permit me here, when yearly ye assemble all. One round I ask it with a tear, to him the bard that's far away. So Burns is pretty heartbroken about the thought he's going. He's going to miss all his friends, and there are so many Masonic references in that song. If you're in the craft, you make a lot of sense of it, but if you're not, it really goes straight above your head. So that was all ready to go. He'd said his fond farewells, and then this happens. His Kilmarnock edition is a huge success, and he makes £50 out of it, which was more than a year's wages for a ploughman in those days. Jamaica's forgotten, and he heads off to Edinburgh, where he's favoured again. He joins joins up with many Freemasons there, who talk him into putting together a second edition of his work, and that becomes the first Edinburgh edition, and then subsequently the second Edinburgh edition. He gets astronomical funds from those of about £800, which in those days was hugely significant to him. He is feted in Edinburgh to a great extent by the rich and the good, but in many ways Burns prefers the company of the common man quite often too. He joins many clubs while he's there, and one of which has Willie as the head. Now, somewhere in here, where have I got that? And that's probably worth letting you hear as well. There's another Masonic song which really gets heard. You Sons of Old Killie. Killie is, of course, the village or the town of Kilmarnock. And the master there became a friend of Burns, and he wrote this for him. Ye sons of Old Killie, assembled by Willie to follow the noble vocation. Your thrifty old mother has scarce such another to sit in that honoured station. I've little to say, but only to pray. Praying's the tongue of your fashion. A prayer from the muse you may well excuse, 'tis seldom a favourite passion. Ye powers who preside o'er the wind and the tide, who mark each element's border, who form the frame with beneficial aim, whose sovereign statute is order, within this dear mansion may wayward contention our withered envy ne'er enter, may secrecy round be the mystical bound, and brotherly love be the centre. So there's another example, just two short verses, but he manages to pack in the last two particularly. Within this dear mansion, within his lodge, may wayward contention or envy never enter. May secrecy round be the mystical bound, so keep the secrets, and brotherly love be the centre. And he manages to put that across in a way that no others could in that few short verses there. These books sold for 5 shillings, back in the old money, 6 shillings, 3,000 copies, which was incredible. The first, I should have said, the first Kilmarnock edition, 606, sold out very quickly in just a few short months. He was persuaded to go to Edinburgh by this man, Dr. Blakelock, who, as you can see, is hard of sight. The guy was blind, but he had a copy of Burns' work read to him, and he thought it was just fantastic. And it was him that convinced Burns to come to Edinburgh to meet the great and the good and to start to make his mark in Edinburgh society. Had he not been around, we probably wouldn't have heard of Burns. For, as I say, it was him who was behind convincing him to come. He was a poet himself, and he writes in the same sort of style. It's not as classy as Burns. It's not as it doesn't grab you in the same way. But you can see again with a Masonic sort of point of view there, where all the earthlit masons join to execute one grand design and strike amazement into fools who laugh at masons and their tools, and so on. And he goes. So he's never been heard of, and had he not been the man perhaps behind Burns coming to Edinburgh, we would never have seen him. We might never have come across that poem. His principal patron in Edinburgh was the Earl of Glencairn, and it was him that managed to convince many of his rich friends to subscribe to Burns' second edition. And when he died quite suddenly, Burns was heartbroken by it, really. He wrote these words to him: the bridegroom may forget the bride, was made his wedded wife yestreen. The monarch may forget the crown that on his head an hour has been. The mother may forget the child that smiles so sweetly on her knee. But I'll remember thee, Glencairn, and all that thou hast done for me. So Burns was very appreciative of the fact that this man had basically put him on the map and managed to do that, and sadly passed away early. All these people are, of course, Masons, and again, had he not been in the craft, he wouldn't have met them. In Edinburgh, he meets Henry Mackenzie, who wrote Man of Feeling and was a member of Lodge Canongate Kilwinning. His publisher in Edinburgh is one William Creech, another Mason, and as many do, they are honoured in Burns' work. So Creech, the publisher, gets Willie was a witty wight and had all things on unco slight. Old Reekie, I keep it tight and trig and braw, but now they'll busker like a fright, for Willie's a war. Now, it's quite hard to understand the Scots in Burns' work quite often. It takes a bit of reading, but Old Reekie there is Edinburgh. And what he's saying is he kept his hand on Edinburgh, he kept it all together, but now he's gone away, so life's going to change because Willie's left. This looks like William Smellie. It's actually pronounced Smiley or Smillie, William Smellie. He was the printer who put Burns' second edition, his Edinburgh editions, together, and he was a fellow Kurrachee Fencible. Here lies a man who did honour to human nature. The Kurrachee Fencibles was an interesting group, mostly of Masons again, which Burns joined in Edinburgh, and they all appreciated humour, particularly with sexual overtones, and they would go and meet in public houses, as they did, and try and come up with verse which it was not for the ladies to listen to. In fact, if you give me 1 second. Much of it is published in a book called, you can see here, The Merry Muses of Caledonia. And that is not for parlour reading. Many of these were written by Burns, and the ones that weren't written by Burns were collected by Burns. And a lot of it is fairly pornographic. And this came together under his Kurrachee Fencibles. It's a side of Burns which is really made very public. But wonderful titles such as 9 Inches Will Please a Lady, and you can go on from there and work out the rest yourself. So an interesting bedtime read for anyone that wants to catch the other side of Burns. And that is the Kurrachee Fencibles. They were a kind of pseudo-regiment. Everyone that joined was given a rank in the regiment. And interestingly enough, some friends of mine put together a second battalion of the Kurrachee Fencibles, and a few of us get together periodically under that umbrella and talk about Burns, have a few drinks, and yeah, probably read 1 or 2 of the poems in that book as well, to be honest. So Burns was inaugurated as Poet Laureate of the Lodge, and that's a famous painting that you're bound to have seen. That exists in almost every Masonic lodge as well. If you get a copy of the book Burns in Edinburgh, it goes through every character in that painting and tells you a little bit about them and who they are and which lodges they were in and the association that they had with Burns. I think it's called A Year in Edinburgh. I have a copy somewhere, but I can't lay my hands on it. Interestingly enough, many of them were not there when he was there. It's quite a fictitious painting that was painted long after, but it makes the point quite well. One of them in particular is the kind of rotund fellow over on the right-hand side who's being leaned on by some cleric in a black outfit. He's probably intended to be Captain Francis Grose, who was a great friend of Burns and an antiquarian. And that means he went around painting old monuments, old buildings. And he'd done that in England, and then he came up to Scotland, and Burns asked him if he would paint the old haunted kirk at Alloway and put it in his next collection of books, which he agreed to do. The reason Burns asked him is his father was buried there in the graveyard, and he agreed to do it if Burns would write a short poem as an introduction to the painting. So Burns went away, and his short poem was Tam O'Shanter. So had he not met that man, had that man not come and asked him to do this very thing for him, we would never have heard that fantastic masterpiece, which is a stalwart in every Burns supper, the Tam O'Shanter. So he's responsible for that. Okay, Burns has got some money, and very few people had in those days. It allows him to travel, because most were born, worked, died in their own parish. There's no trains, there's no buses, there's no cabs. So if you could afford a horse, you could travel a little bit. But if you couldn't do that, you just stayed where you were. But Burns had a bit of money, so he travelled with various people and various tours. Robert Ainsley, one of his friends, and he went down to Eyemouth, and there they were made Royal Arch members. Burns was given it for free because of his notoriety, his fame as a poet. Ainsley, we hear, had to pay for it. But they were honoured to have Burns amongst them. There's a quote there from the Lodge Minutes. The following brethren were made Royal Arch Masons, 19th of May, 1787. Robert Burns from the Lodge of St. James, Tarbolton, and Robert Ainsley from the Lodge of St. Luke's, Edinburgh. And then there's the cast there. Robert Ainsley paid £1 admission, but on account of Burns' remarkable poetical genius, the encampment unanimously agreed to admit him free gratis and considered themselves honoured by having a man of such abilities as one of their companions. So you start to see some of his travels around about by looking at these plaques. You'll find them in many towns around Scotland and just dip down below the borders. But you'll see there on the outside of the building, Lodge St. Ebb, Land of Cakes. In this building, Burns was made a Royal Arch Mason on the 13th of May, 1787. In the latter stage of his life, Burns moved from Edinburgh to Dumfries, and he joined the lodge there. And in fact, that'll be the last lodge he was a member of, St. Andrew 197. That is their gavel, and he would have handled that one. Some call it a maul, some call it a gavel. He also signed their attendance book, which is still in existence today. Now, I mentioned Willie Fisher. He was the church elder that was out trying to catch people in the hypocrisy that Burns talks about in Holy Willie's Prayer. He was, of course, a Freemason as well in Lodge St. Mauchline. Gavin Hamilton, that I mentioned earlier, was the Right Worshipful Master of that lodge. And in 1820, so this is long after Burns has died, the brethren from that lodge laid the foundation stone for his memorial. There's Francis Grose, that you saw earlier in the painting, the antiquarian. Burns describes him as a fine, fat widgeon wight, of stature short, but genius bright. And he was the power behind Tam O'Shanter, the man that made that wonderful poem happen. So, in his career, in a nutshell, we've got Burns initiated 4th July 1781, Lodge St. David's, Tarbolton 174. And he's passed and raised on that date, becomes deputy master, which in effect means he's master of the lodge from 1784 to 1788. He's a joining member of Lodge Kilwinning. He's an honorary member of Lodge 22 Kilmarnock. He's a joining member of Lodge Canongate Kilwinning. He's made Royal Arch, as I said a few moments ago, and probably Knights Templar at the same time, because back in those days, they tended to put the two together. In December 1788, he's the elected member of Lodge St Andrews in Dumfries, and there he becomes senior warden. Since those days, many lodges have been formed and named in his memory, and one or two here I've found: Robert Burns Lodge in London, Robert Burns 440 in Glasgow, Burns St Mary 505 in Kilmarnock, Robbie Burns 860, and many others which have all named themselves to honour probably the lodge's most famous man, and definitely one of Scotland's most famous. To my mind, had he done nothing more than write this one song, it would have been worth remembering forever. Look at the 5th verse in that, and his wish for mankind is that we shall be brothers the world over. The trouble is, we're as far away from that today as we were in Burns' time. Had he not joined the craft, had he not met all those people, had they not sponsored him in his various works, I doubt we would ever have heard of him. But his two kind of most famous songs, probably this one, and of course Auld Lang Syne as well. But I'm just going to finish on this and let you hear it, because to my mind, the sentiment in it is fantastic, and it typifies what we should all be trying to do as Masons. And as I say, sadly, we're as far away from it today as we were back in Burns' day. I'll not do it all. I'll do 1, 3, and 5. This is, of course, Man's Man. Is there for honest poverty that hangs us here, and all that? The coward slave, we pass him by, we dare be poor for all that. For all that, and all that, our toils obscure and all that. The rank is bought back in his stamp, the man's the gold for all that. You see on Barkey called a lord, was struts and stairs and all that. Though hunters worship at his word, he's but a coof for all that. For all that and all that is a ribbon star and all that. The man o' independent mind, he looks and laughs at all that. Then let us pray that come it may, it's come it will, for all that sense and word o'er all the earth shall bear the grief for all that. For all that and all that, it's coming yet, for all that man to man the world o'er shall brothers be for all that. Now, the sentiment in that song, the power in that song is quite inspirational, and it's usually a kind of standing ovation number. If it's done properly at a Burns supper or anything like that, it really grips the heart. But if you read through it, you get a great take on Burns' contempt for the gentry in many ways, who think they're a cut above the rest, and to him the common man's important. The rank is but the guinea's stamp, the man's the gowd for all that. Give fools their salts and knaves their wine, a man's a man for all that. You see on Burkey called a lord, he struts and he stares for all that. Though hundreds worship at his word, he's but a coof for all that, a fool. A prince can make a belted knight, but an honest man's a boonet's mite. And see, you see it coming through again and again until you get to that last verse where he's saying, it doesn't matter the rank or fortune, sense and worth for all the earth shall bear the gree. For all that, man to man, the world o'er, should brothers be for all that. And I think that sentiment he's lived throughout his whole life in his Masonic career, etc., etc. And that's where all that comes from. So that was me as Robert Burns, by the way. Yes. You got a quick glimpse of that. I wrote a one-man show on his 250th anniversary, which has been in about 200 primary schools here and various other places too. I haven't done it for a while now, but that was the kind of basis behind what we're doing there.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for your splendid presentation. And I'm very, very, very honored because you share your time and your knowledge and your music with us. Thank you so much again, Kevin.
My great pleasure, Clive. My great pleasure.